I was born and raised in a culture of witches. Brujeria is a powerful and ubiquitous phenomenon within Latin America. Today I'm going to take you on a journey through the hidden world of Guatemalan Brujeria. This is where ancient Mayan magic shapes lives and destinies. Hello everyone, I am Solomon Pakal. I'm a generational brujo of Kaqchikel Maya descent. I am a historian, and I am an occult researcher with over 2 decades in the game right now. So, disclaimer here, to stay relevant to the subject, we have to distinguish the difference between Maya and Mayan. Mayan academically was used to describe the Mayan calendar and the Mayan languages. Typically, Maya is used for everything else. Nowadays, we're headed to a bit more of interchangeability between those words. Some of my other videos cover the in-depth of why that is, but you will hear Mayan, and I will use the word Mayan as a describer, as an adjective, so Mayan magic. But you will not hear me say the Mayans, that they're the Maya people, the Maya civilization, the Maya. I'm going to talk today about Brujeria. Now, Brujeria is very vast. It's witchcraft in Latin America, in Spanish-speaking countries. Even in Brazil and Portuguese, I think they call it brujeria because Portuguese is slightly different than Spanish. I tip my hat to more contemporary brujas and brujeria authors and authority figures. I'm so glad that many of them are becoming published authors and getting recognition and bringing knowledge and techniques to the forefront of esoteric communities. Authors like J. Allen Cross and Laura Davila. I really recommend everybody taking a look at their books in particular. And as well, I just want to tip my hat to my fellow brujas and brujos. However, I'm going to focus today on the kind of brujeria that I come from, which is from Guatemala. So my mother comes from Guatemala and comes from this urban witchcraft tradition, which would be regarded as brujeria. Now, to keep in mind, brujeria is not an established tradition. There's not initiations, despite there being lineages. You just know that your mom was a bruja, your grandma was a bruja, your aunt was a bruja. It's just a part of the culture. It's a second nature thing, and it has to be the second nature thing and then quickly discarded because of the watchful eye of Catholicism. But brujeria, as a art, weaves the threads of Mayan spirituality, but also Catholic and African spirituality from when Europeans brought slaves over to the New World. In brujeria, there's this syncretism that takes place to disguise old Mayan spirits, whether they be gods or spirits of the land. They would be disguised as Catholic saints. This is nothing new, and this is definitely also true in Afro-Cuban worship. Shango, or Chango, being related to Santa Barbara, or Elewa being St. Anthony. And this syncretism has spread to certain Mayan spirits as well. But brujeria offers a wide range of magical techniques and purposes, but its aim is typically practical magic, practical enchantment. Healing, divination, protection, love spells, all of this stuff is brujeria based. Now for the spirits of brujeria, it's honestly pretty vast. I will cite 2 spirits today, San Simón or Maximón, who is under the guise of Saint Simon, right? But is clearly is a pre-Columbian deity who traces back to what archaeologists had labeled God El for the longest time, but his name was translated to Ekchua or Haalchua. Maximón is a saint of vice, but also a saint, period. And so he blends both saint and sinner, and many people of different kinds of backgrounds come to Maximón. But he is particularly fond of those who live in marginalized or ostracized lifestyles. Maximón is big in the Santiago Atitlan region of Guatemala. There are entire festivals where certain brotherhoods or households will house Maximón, and then they will transport him to a new home at a certain time of the year. A big practice, this is very pre-Columbian too, of dressing the deity, where they will change his clothes and fix him up with new clothes and new ornaments. This can be traced all the way back to Olmec times, where the Olmec jaguar baby god has a divot underneath its neck to where it's theorized that certain wreaths and other regalia would be placed upon the deity. So the art of dressing a deity and dressing a folk saint is actually very pre-Columbian. Another saint we'll be looking at that is coming from Guatemala is San Pascual Rey, or otherwise known as Saint Death. Believe it or not, is the oldest depiction in the Americas of a skeletal robed figure, predating Santa Muerte by a good amount. Saint Death, or San Pascual Rey, is revered for his relationship to illness, his ability to cure illness in particular, and provide all kinds of protection from morbidity. But there are many unique and localized forms of brujeria and protocols for brujeria, particularly in the southwest of Guatemala on the Pacific coast. Brujos perform rituals that are both ancient but evolving. The art of enfrascar are essentially bindings or domination spells that are essentially a signature of brujeria. This is the use of sympathetic links along with spoken incantations. And I think, the normal supplies as well, like candles, incense, but the main crux is utilizing spoken incantations and sympathetic links. Now, they do use some exotic ingredients. I remember some exotic ingredients myself. Things such as toads or particularly bats in the form of curses are used in brujeria, but especially this region of Guatemala. These enfrascars can extend to actual love spells too. So the blending of domination and love spells, this is not just a modern kind of conclusion or a modern theory. Even in brujeria, the distinction was quite interweaving between domination and love. A lot of these kinds of rituals are performed at midnight for maximum potency. Ritual practices in Guatemala are not simply just in isolation. There is a community aspect to all things mystical and magical. Some places more than others. I would say probably where my family comes from, it's a bit more solitary because by the time that my mother was born, it was much more urbanized than like actual Guatemala City. But especially in more rural parts where things are much more like Maya community and rural, and the community has more collective say-so, and it's further away from the established government, the idea of community and community as a concept and ritual is much more prevalent. Here it can reinforce social bonds and address community grievances. Brujeria in Guatemala is blending both community dynamics with spirituality. Brujeria is as much a part of daily life as a mystical path that one undertakes. It is almost an understood part of daily life, second nature. That's why you look at a population like that and you say they're superstitious. By a magician's standards, that superstition is just simply street smarts when it comes to the realms of spirits. Now, if I may, I love brujeria. I love brujeria. I come from brujeria. I have a respect for brujeria. However, I am an occult researcher, and I am an analytical thinker, and I, as a product of the Maya diaspora, my mother wanted me to become educated, just like any parents of coming from a third world country want their children to become educated so that they can have a better life. And that also means identifying the weak points of everything that I do and every art that I engage in. And I will say that every tradition has essentially some kind of asymmetries. They develop certain habits and perceptions, not necessarily weaknesses. Some of them I would say so, but it's better to address these things as asymmetries and just, I guess, prioritized avenues rather than just weaknesses. I bring this up because people get the wrong perceptions of the potency of brujeria, especially in places north of the border, because you're dealing with less superstitious societies. Therefore, brujeria has, I don't want to say it's less effective, but it has different avenues it needs to go down. I see a lot of Americans that want to get into brujeria to dominate a lover, for example. And they find out that it's a lot harder than what they thought it would be. Now, domination spells are real. I have had friends and family that have fallen prey in very creepy ways to brujeria type love spells and domination spells, to where they're just never the same again. So it really is the brujeria doing it. However, I think people look at brujeria as a green light and a as like a for sure way to push their will onto reality without some kind of consequence or some kind of finesse. What I'm speaking of is that they put an overemphasis on getting practical results, and then what happens is that they feel unfulfilled or they damage their lives. I am not speaking from a moral soapbox here. I do not necessarily believe in this hard, strict morality. The universe operates on higher moral axioms than our human perceptions of good and evil. However, there is something to be said for cause and effect and fault and reason. These things exist, and they happen. That's why there are many brujos and brujas that are very unhappy because they get into a lot of coercive work, cursing, love spells, constant manipulation kinds of things. And it's because both in America but also outside of the United States that these places are very cutthroat, and they demand essentially some amount of aggression. Like, it demands an aggression out of you, a magical aggression out of you that is very uncommon to first world lifestyles. And that kind of aggression, I don't think most Western magicians are used to. There's a caveat to that. I know some pretty hardcore, like, Appalachian witches that they go just as hard. It's not a matter of going hard or not. It's just there's a certain ferocity that is demanded out of the practitioner because of where they're coming from. So I also tip my hat off to like those folk witches that come from like Appalachia, because their environment demands that they have a very aggressive approach to magic. And that's the kind of approach that I'm talking about here. But it's also a place that was a demanded poison. And it's not necessarily a poison that everybody should ingest just because they think they can get what they want out of it. There actually may be a better route and an easier route to getting what you want besides trying to force and bind it. So what I will say is that there's this misconception about brujeria being this almost like complete esoteric art. But this unhappiness and unfulfillment that is a byproduct of brujeria comes from a lack of cosmology. Paradoxically, brujeria while it's very vast, is actually a very small part of a larger cosmology that is found in ancient Mesoamerica, in particular from where I come from. But the brujeria in South America comes from those many Amazonian and the Andean Native American cosmologies. Even Appalachia was influenced by northern Native American cosmologies. These cosmologies I bring up are highly holistic. They are highly holistic and very deep, just as deep as anything you will find in the Far East or Western esoteric traditions. But typically because, and this is no disrespect, this is just a demographic truth that you could look up on Wikipedia. You can look this up in any kind of census. The countries from which brujeria comes from are largely illiterate by modern standards. This illiteracy rate means that people know how to do the magic, but they're not privy to the sources necessarily of the larger cosmologies from which brujeria comes from. And you can actually throw in Catholic cosmology into this as well. And while Catholic cosmology is pretty vast as well, most of the people practicing brujeria, they're not theologians. They're not necessarily reading the Bible from an analytical point of view or even a deep diving devotional point of view. It's coming from a pay-as-you-go method. This is because brujeria, the actual techniques, are frowned upon in Latin America, and you can be punished by the same religious organization that they know brujeria is out there and they tolerate it, but if they catch you doing it, they can really hamper your life. You can get physically attacked for practicing brujeria. You could be ostracized socially. Economic opportunities can drop because you will be associated with it. This is why brujeria as a practice is more like, you know the spirit, you know the spell you gotta do, you go to the crossroads or you go to the rivers, you do the spell, you call the spirit, you turn your back, you walk away, you do not look back, and then you go to church on Sunday and you plead for forgiveness. This kind of like pay-as-you-go method and transactional method of magic, while can be highly effective, it can be highly effective take it from somebody who's been in this for over 2 decades and comes from a lineage of brujas, there is a deficiency in brujeria, and that is a lack of theurgy and mysticism. And it's really just a lack of cosmology and greater cosmology and the place of the bruja and the brujo in a larger universe. There is a lot of magic, but a lack of meaning. With brujeria, there's a lot of know-how, but there's not a lot of know-why. And this all stems from the overarching religious persecution and illiteracy rate of people coming from these countries. Now, we can make brujeria better, easily, by just getting more educated. That's why I tip my hats to authors like J. Allen Cross and Laura de Avila, because they cite things in their books about brujeria that you can't learn from other brujos or brujas. They've done their research. That's how we push brujeria forward, is by doing more research and seeing where these things come from and implementing those cosmological factors into our practice, whether they be pre-Columbian or Catholic. It's now all a part of a syncretized worldview. I love brujeria. It's vastly powerful. I just recommend that people get their expectations right before diving into it, and then also reinforce the practical magic, the greater cosmologies, that it's actually embedded in.